The girl sleeping beside Elias Mercer's horse looked more afraid of waking up than dying. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you still believe kindness can change a man's fate out here in the dust and silence, stay with me. Because this story began on a cold Wyoming morning with a cowboy who had spent 6 years trying not to care about anyone anymore. The prairie stretched empty beneath a pale sunrise, 30 miles from the nearest town, the grass silver with frost, and the wind carrying the dry smell of sagebrush across the hills. Elias rode slowly through the low valley, his old bay horse limping slightly, after a long night tracking stray cattle near the creek. He looked exactly like the kind of man people forgot. Weathered hat, dust-covered coat, eyes that rarely stayed on another human face for long. Out here, loneliness became part of the weather. He preferred it that way. Then the horse stopped walking. Completely stopped. Elias frowned and pulled lightly on the reins, but the animal only lowered its head toward the cottonwood tree ahead. That was when Elias saw her. A young woman slept curled against the horse's saddle blanket, as if she had collapsed there sometime during the night. Her blonde hair spilled across the dirt and dry grass, tangled by wind. One bare foot rested beneath the horse's neck. The other was bruised dark from miles of walking. Elias slid down from the saddle slowly, boots crunching softly over frozen ground. He noticed 3 things immediately. First, her dress had once been expensive. Even covered in dust and mud, the stitching and fabric told that story. Second, she was clutching something tightly against her chest. A gold pocket watch with shattered glass across the face. Third, there were hoofprints nearby. Multiple riders. Fresh enough that the dirt still held their shape. The girl stirred before Elias could speak. Her eyes opened fast. Gray eyes. Sharp and frightened at the same time. In one quick movement, she reached beneath her coat and pointed a tiny revolver straight at his chest. Elias froze. The wind whispered through the trees behind them. Somewhere far off, a crow called once across the valley. The girl's hand trembled violently around the pistol. Not from weakness, from exhaustion. Please, she whispered, her voice rough from cold air and sleepless nights. Don't let them take me back. Elias studied her face carefully. There was no anger there. No hatred. Only the kind of fear that came from someone who had spent too many nights running without knowing where the road ended. He slowly raised both hands away from his gun belt. You planning to shoot the only man standing between you and freezing to death? He asked quietly. For a second, something almost human crossed her face. Not trust. Not yet. But surprise. Then her eyes shifted past Elias toward the distant ridge above the valley. Her entire body went still. Elias turned slowly. 3 riders stood motionless on the hill, watching them in complete silence. The 3 riders did not move. That was the part Elias disliked most. Men who came looking for trouble usually shouted first. These men simply watched from the ridge like they already knew how the morning would end. The girl lowered the revolver slightly, though her fingers still trembled around the grip. Elias could hear her breathing now. Fast. Uneven. Like someone trying not to panic in front of a stranger. The wind picked up across the valley floor, carrying dust and the distant creak of saddle leather from the hill above. One of the riders wore a dark coat too fine for ranch work. Another sat perfectly straight in the saddle with polished boots that caught the pale morning light. Wealthy men, or men pretending to be. Elias glanced down at the broken pocket watch still clutched in the girl's hand. The gold casing looked expensive enough to feed a ranch family for a year. Friends of yours? He asked quietly. The girl shook her head immediately. Too quickly. No, her voice cracked on the word. Elias studied her another second. Then he took a slow breath and reached carefully for the horse reins. You can point that little pistol somewhere else now, he said. If I wanted to hand you over, I would not still be standing here talking. For the first time since waking up, she looked directly at him. Really looked at him. His worn coat. The faded cavalry scar near his jaw. The dust ground deep into his boots after years of hard country and harder winters. There was something strange in her expression then. Confusion, maybe. Like Elias Mercer did not match whatever kind of man she expected to find alone out here. Slowly, she lowered the gun completely. But she did not put it away. What is your name? Elias asked. She hesitated long enough to tell him the answer mattered. Clara. Nothing else. No last name. No explanation. Just Clara. One of the riders on the ridge shifted slightly, his horse stepping sideways against the wind. Elias felt the tension change immediately beside him. Clara's shoulders tightened. Her breathing shortened again. He had seen that reaction before. Soldiers carried it after battles. Children carried it after bad storms. People carried it when fear had followed them for too long. "All right, Clara," Elias said quietly. "You have about 30 seconds to tell me whether those men are going to bring trouble onto my land." Her gray eyes filled with something that looked dangerously close to shame. "Trouble follows them everywhere," she whispered. Then she surprised him. She looked down at his horse and gently brushed her fingers along the animal's neck. The old bay stood perfectly calm beneath her touch. Elias frowned slightly. His horse trusted almost nobody. "Funny thing," Elias muttered. "He usually bites strangers." A faint smile touched Clara's mouth for less than a second before disappearing again. It was small, tired, but real enough to make the cold morning feel less empty somehow. Then the rider in the dark coat started down the hill. Slow, deliberate. The others followed behind him without speaking. Clara stepped backwards so fast she nearly stumbled against the tree trunk. Her face went pale beneath the dust on her skin. "Please," she whispered again. "Do not tell them my name." Elias watched the riders descending through the tall grass toward the valley floor. Something old and restless stirred in his chest then, a feeling he had spent years trying to bury beneath silence and isolation. Trouble had finally found his ranch, and somehow, against all common sense, the first thing Elias Mercer wanted to do was protect the frightened girl standing beside his horse. The riders crossed the valley without hurry, and somehow that made them feel more dangerous than men charging with rifles raised. Elias stood beside the cottonwood tree with one hand resting near his belt, while Clara remained half hidden behind the horse, clutching the broken watch against her chest like it mattered more than food or sleep or warmth. Dust rolled softly beneath the horse's hooves as the three men approached within 20 feet and finally stopped. The man in the dark coat removed his gloves carefully before speaking. He looked about 50, clean-shaven, with silver streaks along his temples and eyes too cold for such a calm face. "Morning," he said politely. "Sorry to trouble you this early." Elias did not answer immediately. He studied the riders instead. Expensive saddles. Fine leather. Railroad men, maybe. Or bankers. Men who believed money solved every problem eventually. The older man's gaze shifted toward Clara for half a second before returning to Elias again. "We are searching for a young woman," he continued smoothly. "My employer's daughter. She is unwell and wandered off 2 nights ago during travel." Clara's breathing stopped completely beside the horse. Elias noticed it instantly. "That's so," he said quietly. "You lose lots of daughters out here?" One of the younger riders frowned, but the older man only smiled faintly. "She has been through emotional difficulties." His eyes moved toward the broken watch in Clara's hand. "Miss Bellamy is frightened easily these days." Bellamy. The name settled heavily in the cold morning air. Elias knew it immediately. Everyone west of Cheyenne knew it. Bellamy rail lines had laid track through half the territory in the last decade. Rich enough to buy sheriffs. Rich enough to bury stories nobody wanted told. Clara lowered her eyes the moment the name was spoken aloud. The older man noticed. "There you are," he said softly, almost gently. "You have caused your father considerable concern." "Father." Elias felt Clara tense harder against the horse beside him. Strange thing was, she did not look relieved. She looked trapped. The wind rattled dry branches overhead while nobody moved for several long seconds. Then Elias noticed something else. Clara's bare feet were cut from miles of walking. Her hands shook from exhaustion. Yet when the man called her by name, she stepped backward instead of forward, like prey hearing a hunter whistle in the dark. Elias had seen enough people lying in his life to recognize truth when fear carried it. "She does not seem eager to go," he said flatly. The younger rider immediately stiffened, but the older man remained perfectly calm. Family matters are often complicated. That is one word for it. Clara suddenly grabbed Elias's coat sleeve with cold, trembling fingers. The movement was small enough most men might have missed it. Elias did not. Her voice came barely above a whisper. "Please." Just one word. But there was something inside it that unsettled him more than the riders themselves. Not drama. Not manipulation. Desperation worn thin from too many sleepless nights. The older man sighed quietly and reached into his coat pocket. "Mr. Mercer." "Mr. Mercer," the man continued smoothly. "If you return Miss Bellamy to us, Her family would be very grateful. Financially grateful. Elias looked at the folded bills appearing in the man's gloved hand. More money than he usually saw in 6 months. Clara closed her eyes beside him like she already knew how this story ended. The valley fell silent except for the low creak of saddle leather and distant wind across the prairie grass. Elias stared at the money for a long moment. Then his eyes slowly lifted toward Clara again. What he saw on her face changed everything. She was already preparing herself to be abandoned. Elias had not touched another man's money in almost 3 years. Not after the railroad dispute. Not after losing half his cattle because wealthy men in polished boots decided the land beneath his ranch mattered more than the people living on it. So when the older rider extended the folded bills toward him, Elias only stared at them with tired eyes. Then he looked at Clara again. She had gone completely still beside the horse. No pleading anymore. No hope. Either. Just that hollow look people carried when disappointment had become familiar. Like she had already learned kindness usually came with a price. The older man noticed the silence stretching too long between them. "It is a generous offer," he said calmly. "Miss Bellamy belongs with her family." Elias finally spoke. "Funny thing about people," he muttered. "They usually walk toward places they belong." One of the younger riders shifted sharply in the saddle. "Watch your mouth." The older man lifted a hand slightly, silencing him without effort. Clara lowered her eyes toward the dirt, but Elias noticed her grip tightening around the broken pocket watch until her knuckles turned pale. Wind rolled across the valley again, colder now, carrying the smell of distant snow somewhere high in the mountains. Elias slowly stepped between Clara and the riders. It was not dramatic, barely one step, but the change in the air was immediate. The younger men straightened. Horses snorted softly. Somewhere overhead, dry branches knocked together in the wind like old bones. "She says she does not want to go," Elias said quietly. "Looks simple enough to me." The older rider studied him carefully then. Really studied him. The faded military posture. The scar near his jaw. The ranch horse branded with an old cavalry mark beneath the saddle blanket. Something shifted behind the man's cold eyes. Recognition, maybe. "You served," he said. "Long time ago. You were at Fort Bridger," the man continued softly. "Third Cavalry." Elias did not answer. Clara looked up sharply beside him. The older rider gave a faint nod, almost respectful. "Walter Bellamy values capable men. He always has." There it was again. Not concern for his daughter. Not relief at finding her alive. Just business hidden beneath polished manners. Elias felt Clara trembling beside the horse now despite the sunlight slowly climbing over the valley. "Tell your employer something for me," Elias said. "If his daughter wants to leave, she leaves." One of the younger riders laughed under his breath. "You think this is your decision?" Elias ignored him completely. The older man sighed quietly and folded the money back into his coat. "Mr. Mercer, I do not believe you understand the situation." "Then explain it." For the first time, the older rider's calm expression hardened slightly around the edges. "Miss Bellamy is not emotionally stable. Her mother passed away last winter. Since then, she has become confused, paranoid. Her father only wishes to bring her home safely before she harms herself wandering through this country alone." Clara suddenly spoke, and her voice carried more anger than fear now. "That is not true." It startled everyone slightly, even Elias. The older rider looked toward her with patient disappointment, like a teacher correcting a child. "Clara, do not call me that." The words came sharper this time, stronger. Elias noticed tears standing in her eyes now, but she refused to let them fall. "He locked me inside that house for 4 months, she whispered. "He told everyone I was sick because I would not marry the man he chose." Silence settled heavily over the valley. Even the horses seemed quieter somehow. The older rider removed one glove slowly and rubbed tired fingers across his brow. "You are exhausted," he said gently. "You are frightened. Your father understands that." Clara shook her head once. "No," she whispered. "My father understands ownership." Elias felt something cold settle deep in his chest then, because suddenly the frightened girl beside his horse no longer looked like someone running from home. She looked like someone escaping it. The older rider stared at Elias for several long seconds after Clara spoke those words. Ownership. The word lingered in the cold Wyoming air heavier than the clouds gathering above the mountains. Then the man adjusted his gloves calmly, like wealthy men always did when conversations became inconvenient. Miss Bellamy is tired, he said, and grief often confuses memory. Clara let out a quiet laugh that sounded painfully close to breaking apart. Memory, she whispered. You boarded the windows yourself. Elias watched the older rider carefully now. Not his face, his eyes. Men usually revealed themselves there first. For the first time since riding into the valley, irritation flickered beneath the man's polished calm. One of the younger riders leaned slightly forward in his saddle. Enough of this, he muttered. We take her home now. Elias finally rested one hand against the grip of his revolver, not drawing it, just letting the movement speak for itself. The horses shifted uneasily beneath the tension settling across the valley floor. Dry grass whispered beneath the wind while the old bay horse beside Clara stood perfectly still, almost protective. The older rider slowly lifted a hand again, stopping the younger man before anything foolish happened. Mr. Mercer, he said quietly, you do not understand the danger of involving yourself in Bellamy family matters. Elias looked out across the empty plains surrounding his ranch. 40 miles of open country. No neighbors. No sheriff riding through to save anybody. Just wind, dust, and silence. Out here, Elias said softly, a man usually understands trouble the second he sees it. Clara lowered her eyes suddenly, and Elias noticed tears finally slipping down her face despite how hard she tried hiding them. Not loud tears. Not dramatic ones. Just exhaustion leaking through cracks she could not hold closed anymore. I did not steal anything, she whispered. I did not hurt anyone. I only said no. The younger rider scoffed beneath his breath, but the older man remained silent. Clara slowly opened the broken pocket watch in her trembling hand. Inside the cracked glass was a tiny photograph of a woman smiling softly beneath a wide-brimmed summer hat. Elias caught only a glimpse before Clara closed it again. My mother gave me this before she died, Clara said. 3 weeks later my father announced I was to marry Theodore Ashcombe. Even the older rider looked uncomfortable hearing the name. Elias noticed that immediately. Rich banker from Denver? Elias asked. Clara nodded once. Twice my age. Wind pushed strands of blonde hair across her exhausted face, while distant thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the mountains. The storm was still far away, but coming closer. When I refused, Clara continued quietly. My father said grief had damaged my judgment. Then the doctors started visiting the house. Elias felt something tighten in his chest at the way she said doctors. Like the word itself carried fear now. They watched me constantly. They locked every door upstairs. My father told people I was unstable. Her voice cracked again. After a while, even the servants stopped speaking to me normally. Silence settled over the valley. The older rider removed his hat slowly, almost respectfully. Your father was trying to protect you, he said. Clara looked at him, then with tired disbelief. No, she whispered. He was trying to protect his railroad deal. Elias finally understood it clearly now. This was never about family, never about concern. Clara Bellamy was simply another valuable thing powerful men expected to control. Like land, like cattle, like railroad tracks stretching across territory they never truly belonged to. The older rider glanced toward the darkening sky and sighed softly. A storm is coming, he said. Miss Bellamy cannot survive another night alone in this country. Elias looked toward Clara beside the horse. Barefoot, exhausted, shaking from cold and fear and days without rest. Then he looked back at the riders waiting to drag her toward a life she clearly dreaded more than the wilderness itself. And for reasons he could not fully explain yet, Elias Mercer suddenly realized he would rather invite a storm onto his ranch than hand her back to those men. The first raindrop hit the dust between the horses like a warning. Then another followed. Cold wind swept through the valley hard enough to bend the tall prairie grass sideways, while dark clouds rolled lower across the mountains to the west. The older rider glanced toward the sky and knew the same thing Elias did. Nobody wanted to be trapped outside once a Wyoming storm decided to arrive. We will return tomorrow, the man said calmly as he pulled his gloves tighter. Miss Bellamy's father is not accustomed to hearing the word no. Clara flinched at the mention of her father again. Elias noticed every small reaction now. The way her shoulders tightened. The way her fingers instinctively searched for the broken watch whenever fear crept closer. The older rider gave Elias one final look before turning his horse slowly toward the ridge. "You seem like a decent man, Mr. Mercer," he said. "That is precisely why this situation concerns me." Then the three riders disappeared back across the valley through rising curtains of dust and rain. Clara did not move until they became tiny shapes against the distant hills. Only then did her knees suddenly weaken beneath her. Elias caught her arm before she hit the ground completely. Her skin felt freezing cold even through the fabric of his coat sleeve. "Easy," he muttered. Clara tried pulling away immediately, embarrassed by her own exhaustion. "I am fine." "No," Elias said quietly. "You are stubborn." Different thing. Thunder rolled again, much closer this time. The horse snorted uneasily beside them as wind tore through the cottonwood branches overhead. Elias picked up the reins and nodded toward the north pasture, where his ranch house sat nearly half a mile away beneath the darkening sky. Smoke drifted weakly from the chimney. Small, weather-beaten, lonely as the man who lived there. Clara stared at it uncertainly. "You do not have to do this." Elias started walking through the grass without answering right away. Clara limped beside the horse quietly, one hand holding the broken watch inside her coat pocket. "Most people would have taken the money," she said after a long silence. Elias kept his eyes on the distant ranch house ahead. "Most people got more sense than me." That almost earned another smile from her. Almost. Rain began falling harder now, tapping softly against leather and dry earth while cold wind carried the sharp scent of coming stormwater across the plains. Clara stumbled once from exhaustion, and Elias noticed her trying to hide the pain in her bare feet. "How far did you walk?" he asked. "Since yesterday?" She hesitated. "Around 18 miles. Elias glanced at her bruised feet again beneath the muddy hem of her dress. "In those conditions?" Clara looked down quietly. "I could not stop." Something about the way she said it bothered him deeply. Not dramatic, just honest. Like she had spent the last several days moving forward on fear alone. They reached the ranch as rain finally broke fully across the valley. In silver sheets, the house groaned softly beneath the wind, old wood shifting from another hard season on the prairie. Elias pushed open the front door, and warm air carrying the smell of cedar smoke drifted out around them. Clara stopped at the doorway instead of entering. Elias looked back at her. She stood there drenched from rain, blonde hair plastered against her face, still clutching that broken watch like a lifeline. But it was her expression that unsettled him most. Suspicion, hesitation, like kindness itself, had become something dangerous to trust. "What?" Elias asked quietly. Clara swallowed hard before answering. "Nothing." Then after several seconds, she whispered the truth anyway. "I just cannot remember the last time someone opened a door for me without wanting something in return." Elias stared at her for a moment while rain hammered against the roof overhead. Then he stepped aside from the doorway and spoke softly enough that she almost did not hear it. "Out here," he said, "a storm is reason enough." Rain hammered the ranch roof through most of the afternoon, while Clara sat quietly near the fire wrapped in one of Elias's old wool blankets. The house smelled of cedar smoke, damp leather, and coffee grounds warming slowly on the stove. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains hard enough to rattle the window panes every few minutes. But inside the small ranch house, the silence between them felt even louder. Elias moved carefully around the kitchen, pretending not to notice how Clara watched every sound, every movement. The scrape of a chair across the floor made her flinch slightly. The creak of the front door in the wind made her fingers tighten around the warm coffee mug in her hands. Fear had settled so deeply inside her that even safety seemed unfamiliar now. Elias finally placed a plate of beans and bread near her side of the table. "It is not much," he muttered. Clara looked down at the food quietly before speaking. "It looks better than anything I have eaten in days." Elias sat across from her without answering. Rain streaked the windows behind them while shadows from the firelight moved softly along the old wooden walls. Clara ate slowly at first, like someone trying not to seem desperate, but eventually hunger won the argument. Elias pretended not to notice. Men who lived alone learned when silence was kinder than questions. After a while, Clara glanced toward the piano standing dusty and forgotten near the far wall. "You play?" she asked softly. Elias looked over his shoulder toward the instrument. "Not anymore." "Why not?" He shrugged once. "Something stopped sounding right after enough years pass." Clara lowered her eyes again as though she understood that answer better than he expected. The storm outside deepened toward evening. Wind pushed cold rain against the house in heavy waves while distant lightning flashed silver through the cracks beside the windows. Elias rose to place another log on the fire when Clara suddenly spoke again. You really were cavalry? He paused slightly before nodding once. Long time ago. The rider recognized you. Elias stared into the flames for several quiet seconds. There are men who remember things because they mattered, he said softly, and men who remember because they never forgot what scared them. Clara studied him carefully then. Which one are you? Elias gave the faintest smile without humor. Depends who is telling the story. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Clara laughed quietly. The sound surprised both of them. Small, brief, but real enough to soften the heaviness hanging in the room. Elias looked at her across the firelight and suddenly noticed something beneath the exhaustion and fear. She could not have been older than 23, yet her eyes carried the tiredness of someone much older. Someone who had spent too much time trapped inside rooms where every conversation felt like a cage. Clara slowly opened the broken pocket watch again and stared at the tiny photograph inside. My mother used to play piano every evening before dinner, she whispered. The whole house sounded different when she was alive. Rain drummed steadily overhead while Elias watched the fire crackle between them. What happened to her? Clara's expression dimmed immediately. She got sick last winter. Her thumb brushed gently across the cracked watch. Glass. After she died, my father changed very quickly. The room fell quiet again except for the storm outside. Then Clara looked toward the dusty piano once more. Would you mind if I tried? Elias hesitated. Nobody had touched that piano in nearly 6 years. Not since the woman who once filled this ranch with music disappeared from his life along with everything else worth keeping. But something about Clara's voice made it difficult to say no. He nodded once toward the instrument. Clara walked slowly across the room and pressed one careful finger against the yellowed keys. A soft note drifted through the ranch house beneath the sound of rain. Then another followed. Elias stood motionless near the fire as music quietly returned to his home for the first time in years. The music drifted softly through the ranch house, while rain battered the windows outside like handfuls of gravel thrown against the glass. Clara played slowly at first, careful fingers moving across dusty piano keys that had not been touched in years. The melody sounded old, gentle, the kind of song people once danced to before life hardened them into silence. Elias stood near the fireplace without moving, one hand resting against the rough wooden mantel while shadows flickered across his face from the firelight. He had forgotten what music could do to a room, forgotten how it filled empty corners people stopped noticing after too much time alone. Clara looked different while she played. The fear in her shoulders loosened slightly. The exhaustion in her eyes faded for a few moments beneath the warm glow of memory. My mother loved this song, she said quietly without looking back at him. Elias nodded, once even though she could not see it. Mine too. Clara's hands slowed on the keys. You had family here? The question settled gently between them. Elias stared into the flames for a long time before answering. Once. Nothing more. But Clara understood enough not to push further. Some grief spoke loudest through silence. Thunder rolled again outside, deeper now, and the old ranch house creaked beneath another hard gust of Wyoming wind. Clara closed the piano softly and stood near the window, watching rain race down the glass. They will come back tomorrow, she whispered. Elias crossed toward the stove and poured fresh coffee into 2 tin cups. Probably. You do not sound worried. Elias handed her one of the cups carefully. Worry wastes energy. Storms still come anyway. Clara wrapped both cold hands around the warm tin cup and lowered her eyes. You should let them take me when they return. Elias leaned one shoulder against the wall beside the window. You saying that because you believe it, he asked quietly, or because you are scared somebody might get hurt helping you? Clara did not answer right away. Outside, lightning flashed white across the prairie, illuminating the endless rain-soaked grasslands beyond the ranch for one brief second. Then darkness swallowed everything again. My father ruins people, she whispered finally. That is how men like him survive. Elias studied her face carefully in the dim firelight. There it was again. Not fear for herself. Fear for him. Strange thing was, nobody had worried about Elias Mercer in a very long time. He looked away first. You hungry again? Clara blinked slightly, surprised by the sudden change of subject. A little. Good, Elias muttered. Means you are planning on staying alive. He moved toward the kitchen shelves, searching through cans and dry goods while Clara watched him quietly. Something softer had entered the room, now beneath the storm and silence. Not romance. Not yet. Just two lonely people slowly realizing they no longer felt entirely alone. Then a sharp sound cut through the house. 3 knocks against the front door. Heavy. Deliberate. Clara nearly dropped the coffee cup. Elias froze instantly beside the stove. The storm outside had grown loud enough that nobody should have reached the ranch this late unless they truly intended to. Another knock echoed through the house. Slow. Patient. Clara's face lost all color again. They came back, she whispered. Elias set the coffee pot down carefully and walked toward the door without rushing. Years in the cavalry had taught him dangerous men often moved slower than frightened ones. The knocking stopped completely as he reached the entrance. Rain hammered the roof overhead, while cold wind hissed beneath the cracks around the doorway. Elias rested one hand near his revolver before opening the door halfway. A teenage boy stood outside drenched by rainwater, breathing hard beside a mud-covered horse. He could not have been older than 16. "Mr. Mercer?" the boy asked urgently. "Sheriff sent me from town." Elias frowned immediately. "Why?" The boy swallowed hard and looked past Elias toward Clara, standing frozen near the piano. "Because half the county just saw new wanted posters go up," he said. "And the woman staying in your ranch is being accused of murder." The room went completely silent after the boy spoke those words. Murder. Even the storm outside seemed farther away for one strange second. Clara stood frozen beside the piano, her face drained pale beneath the firelight, while rainwater dripped steadily from the teenage messenger's coat onto the wooden floorboards near the doorway. Elias stared at the boy carefully. "Say that again." The boy swallowed hard. "Sheriff put posters all over town tonight. Says Clara Bellamy poisoned a man in Denver 3 days ago before fleeing west." Clara shook her head immediately. "No." Her voice cracked so softly it almost disappeared beneath the thunder outside. "That is not true." The boy shifted uneasily. "Folks in town do not know what to believe. But Bellamy money talks louder than most people." Elias knew that part was true. He had seen railroad men bury honest ranchers beneath paperwork and lies without ever raising their voices. Powerful families did not need guns to ruin lives. They only needed people willing to listen. Clara slowly backed away from the doorway like the walls themselves had started closing around her again. "Who did they say died?" Elias asked quietly. "Theodore Ashcombe." Clara's eyes closed instantly at the name. The reaction lasted barely a second, but Elias caught it. Not guilt. Pain. The kind that comes when somebody mentions a future you spent months dreading. The boy rubbed rainwater from his face nervously. "Sheriff said Ashcombe collapsed during dinner at the Bellamy estate. 2 days later, Miss Bellamy vanished." Clara suddenly looked toward Elias with panic rising behind her gray eyes. "I did not poison anyone," she whispered. "I swear it." Elias held her gaze for several seconds without answering. Then he turned back toward the boy. "Who else knows she might be here?" "Nobody yet," the boy replied quickly. "Sheriff sent me ahead quiet because he remembers you from the cavalry days. Said if anybody could figure truth from lies, it would be Elias Mercer." That surprised him slightly. He had not spoken to Sheriff Holden in nearly 4 years. Still, old soldiers remembered one another differently than ordinary men did. The boy stepped farther inside as another burst of rain hammered the roof overhead. "Sheriff also said Bellamy men are offering $5,000 for information." Clara lowered herself slowly into the chair beside the piano like her strength had finally disappeared completely. $5,000. Enough money to change a rancher's life forever. Enough money to make desperate men dangerous. Elias walked toward the front window and looked out into the storm-dark prairie beyond the ranch. Somewhere out there, railroad men were likely already searching every road, every stable, every lonely ranch house between Wyoming and Colorado. "Mr. Mercer," the boy asked carefully, "is she really innocent?" Elias remained quiet for so long the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Then he finally glanced back toward Clara sitting near the firelight, clutching the broken watch in both trembling hands. Exhausted, terrified, yet somehow still carrying herself with the dignity of somebody refusing to break completely no matter how hard the world pushed against her. "I think," Elias said slowly, "powerful people get nervous when somebody refuses to obey them." Clara looked up sharply at him. The storm flashed silver through the windows behind her, while tears gathered silently in her eyes again. Not because he solved anything. Not because danger disappeared. But because for the first time since running away, someone had looked at her like a person instead of a scandal. The teenage messenger shifted awkwardly near the door. "Sheriff said to bring you both into town by morning if possible." Elias nodded once. "Tell Holden I will decide by sunrise." The boy hesitated. "And if Bellamy men arrive first?" Elias looked back toward the dark prairie outside, where thunder rolled low across the plains. Then his hand rested quietly against the revolver at his hip. "Then they better pray the storm reaches them before I do." The storm finally began weakening near midnight, but the ranch house still groaned beneath hard Wyoming wind while Elias sat awake, near the fire, cleaning his old cavalry revolver with slow, careful hands. Across the room, Clara slept lightly beneath the wool blanket on the small couch beside the piano, though every crack of thunder still made her stir uneasily. The teenage messenger had left an hour earlier after warming himself by the stove, carrying Elias's promise that they would ride into town at first light. But Elias had not decided anything yet. He stared into the fire while memories he usually kept buried started crawling back through the silence. Railroad men, wealthy families, powerful men deciding which truths mattered and which disappeared. He knew that world too well already. Clara shifted suddenly in her sleep and whispered something too soft to understand. Elias glanced toward her. Even sleeping, she looked exhausted. Like fear itself had worn her down one piece at a time. The broken pocket watch still rested tightly in her hand. She had not let go of it once all evening. Rainwater dripped steadily from the roof outside, while dying firelight painted soft shadows across the room. Then Clara's eyes opened slowly. For a moment, she looked confused by the quiet ranch house around her. Then reality returned. Elias saw it happen. The fear, the memory, the uncertainty. "What time is it?" she asked softly. "Late." She sat up carefully beneath the blanket and looked toward the storm-dark windows. "You should sleep." Elias gave a faint shrug. "Never got good at it." Clara studied him across the firelight for several seconds before speaking again. "Why do you live all the way out here alone?" Elias leaned back in the wooden chair without answering immediately. Most people in town stopped asking him questions years ago. They learned silence sat easier around Elias Mercer than conversation ever did. But Clara waited patiently, not demanding answers, just listening. Strange thing was, he found himself wanting to speak anyway. "After the war," he said quietly, "I spent a long time around men who thought power gave them permission to decide who mattered." Clara lowered her eyes slightly. Elias continued staring into the flames. "Eventually, I realized lonely places make more sense than cruel ones." Silence settled softly between them while the wind whispered against the walls outside. Then Clara surprised him again. "My mother used to say almost the same thing." Elias looked up at her. Clara brushed loose strands of blonde hair away from her face and gave the faintest tired smile. She hated parties, hated wealthy people pretending kindness while trying to destroy each other over dinner. Elias almost smiled himself at that. Almost. Then Clara's expression slowly dimmed again. "I should tell you the truth about Theodore Ashcombe." The room became still. Elias set the revolver carefully onto the table beside him and waited. Clara held the broken watch tightly between both hands while firelight flickered across the cracked gold surface. "3 nights ago," she whispered, "my father invited Theodore to the estate for dinner. They wanted me to announce the engagement publicly." Her voice trembled slightly now. "I refused again." Elias watched her closely but said nothing. "Theodore followed me into the garden afterward. He told me it did not matter what I wanted anymore, because my father already signed contracts tying the marriage to the railroad expansion deal." Clara swallowed hard. Then he said eventually I would learn obedience. The last word barely escaped her lips. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly far beyond the hills now. The storm was finally moving away. Clara stared down at the broken watch in her hands. "I left the estate that same night," she whispered. "By morning Theodore Ashcombe was dead." Elias studied her face carefully in the dim firelight. Fear, exhaustion, grief, but not dishonesty. He had seen lying eyes before. Clara Bellamy did not carry them. Then she looked up at him with tears quietly filling her gray eyes again. "You believe me," she whispered softly, almost like she could not understand it herself. Elias held her gaze for a long moment before answering. I believe frightened people do not usually run toward storms unless something worse is chasing them. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the prairie washed silver beneath a cold Wyoming sunrise. Water dripped from the ranch roof in steady rhythms, while fog rolled low across the grasslands beyond the fences. Elias stood outside near the horse trough tightening a saddle strap when he heard the front door open behind him. Clara stepped carefully onto the porch wrapped in his oversized wool coat, her blonde hair still loose from sleep. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she looked rested. Not safe, not peaceful, but rested enough to remember what hope felt like. She watched Elias saddle the horse for several quiet seconds before speaking. You are going into town. It was not a question. Elias nodded once without looking up. Need to talk to Sheriff Holden before Bellamy men fill his office with lies. Clara gripped the coat tighter around herself against the cold morning wind. And if the sheriff believes them? Elias finally looked toward her. Then I come back here and think of something else. Clara lowered her eyes slightly. You make impossible things sound simple. Elias gave a faint shrug. That is because worrying never fixed much on the frontier. A weak smile touched Clara's face before fading again. The silence between them no longer felt awkward now. Strange how quickly loneliness adjusted once another heartbeat entered the room. Elias finished saddling the horse and reached for the reins when Clara suddenly stepped down from the porch. Wait. He turned back toward her. Clara hesitated for several seconds before slowly holding out the broken gold pocket watch in both hands. Morning sunlight caught the cracked glass softly between them. If something happens, she whispered, I want you to keep this. Elias frowned immediately. Nothing is happening. You do not know that. Her voice trembled slightly now despite how hard she tried controlling it. Men like my father do not lose gracefully. Elias stared at the watch without taking it. Your mother gave that to you. Clara nodded. Which is exactly why I trust you with it. Those words settled strangely deep inside him. Trust. Elias Mercer had spent years avoiding people because trust usually led to disappointment or graves or both. Yet somehow this frightened woman from a wealthy railroad family had placed more faith in him after 2 days than most men managed in a lifetime. Slowly, Elias closed her fingers back around the watch instead. Keep it, he said quietly. You might need reminding who you are before all this ends. Clara looked down at the watch in silence. Then suddenly hoofbeats echoed faintly across the prairie. Fast. Multiple riders. Elias turned instantly toward the distant ridge east of the ranch. 3 horses appeared through the morning fog riding hard toward the property. Clara's face lost color immediately. That is not the sheriff. Elias narrowed his eyes. No polished railroad men this time. These riders wore dark dusters and carried themselves differently. Rougher. Quicker. The lead rider raised one arm sharply as they approached the ranch fence. Mercer, the man shouted across the wind. Bellamy men just paid half the county to hunt that girl down. Elias rested one hand near his revolver automatically. Who are you? The riders slowed near the gate, their horses breathing clouds into the cold air. The lead man removed his hat, revealing a weathered face Elias recognized after several seconds. Deputy Marshal Grant Holloway. They had crossed paths years earlier moving cattle through Kansas territory. Holloway looked grim beneath the morning light. Sheriff Holden sent me, he said urgently. Bellamy already reached the judge in town before sunrise. Clara stepped backward slowly behind Elias as Holloway's expression darkened further. There is a federal warrant coming by train tonight, the marshal continued. Once that arrives, nobody in Wyoming territory will be legally allowed to protect her anymore. The prairie fell silent except for cold wind moving through wet grass. Clara stared at the ground beside the porch, clutching the broken watch tightly enough her hands shook again. Then Holloway said the one thing that made even Elias Mercer feel the world shift beneath his boots. And according to the sheriff, the marshal said quietly, Bellamy is not trying to bring his daughter home anymore. Holloway looked directly toward Clara then. He is trying to make sure she never speaks in court. The words hung over the ranch like another storm rolling across the plains. Clara did not speak. She stood beside the porch gripping the broken watch so tightly her knuckles lost all color, while cold morning wind pulled strands of blonde hair across her face. Elias watched her carefully. Fear had returned to her eyes again, but this time it was different. Not fear of being dragged home. Fear of disappearing completely before anybody heard the truth. Marshall Holloway climbed down from his horse slowly, boots sinking into the wet prairie grass. Sheriff Holden believes Bellamy is cleaning up loose ends, he said quietly. Theodore Ashcombe handled most of the railroad contracts in Denver. If somebody discovers the engagement was forced, or that Miss Bellamy was being isolated against her will, the newspapers could destroy Bellamy's expansion deal. Clara laughed softly then, though there was no humor left in the sound. So now I am more dangerous alive than dead. Nobody answered because nobody needed to. Elias looked toward the horizon where sunlight slowly burned through the last layers of storm fog across the prairie. Out here, truth often arrived too late to matter. Holloway removed a folded document from inside his coat and handed it toward Elias. Holden asked me to show you this before deciding anything. Elias unfolded the damp paper carefully. His eyes narrowed almost immediately. Railroad signatures, property transfers, legal agreements tied to Theodore Ashcombe's banking interests. Then one final page. Clara's name written across the bottom beside a marriage contract dated nearly 6 months earlier. Elias looked up sharply. She already signed this? Clara shook her head immediately. I never saw it before. Holloway nodded grimly. Sheriff thinks the signature was copied from old family documents. Clara stared at the paper like it physically hurt to look at. My father was going to marry me off whether I agreed or not. Elias folded the documents slowly while anger settled deep behind his calm expression. Not loud anger. The dangerous kind. Quiet. Controlled. There is more, Holloway said carefully. He reached inside his coat again and removed a small silver key attached to a faded blue ribbon. Clara froze the moment she saw it. Where did you get that? Sheriff found it hidden inside Theodore Ashcombe's hotel room after he died. Holloway handed the key toward her. His room also contained letters addressed to your father discussing railroad land purchases near Cheyenne. Clara stared at the ribbon with shaking hands. This belonged to my mother. Elias watched confusion and realization collide across her face at the same time. Clara slowly looked up. My mother kept private journals locked inside a cedar chest in her bedroom. Holloway nodded once. Then there is a good chance Bellamy is searching for those journals too. The prairie wind moved softly around them, while everything suddenly began fitting together in terrible ways. Clara's father had not simply wanted obedience. He wanted silence. Permanent silence. Elias looked toward Clara standing small and frightened against the endless Wyoming plains, yet somehow still refusing to collapse beneath the weight of it all. Where's the chest now? He asked. Clara swallowed hard. Still at the Bellamy estate. Holloway exhaled slowly. Then that ranch is the only place left holding proof strong enough to stop this. Silence settled over the group, while horses shifted impatiently near the fence. Finally, Clara shook her head faintly. There is no way back into that house now. Elias looked down at the folded contracts in his hand, then toward the endless western horizon stretching beyond the ranch. There is always a way into places powerful men think nobody can reach. Clara stared at him carefully. You cannot possibly mean. Elias handed the papers back toward Holloway without taking his eyes off the distant plains. How far to Denver by rail? The marshal studied him for several seconds before answering quietly. About 16 hours if the tracks stay clear. Clara's breath caught softly as realization settled in. The wind moved through the wet prairie grass around them while Elias Mercer finally made the decision that would change all their lives forever. He was not going to hand Clara Bellamy over. He was going to ride straight toward the men hunting her. 3 weeks later, the Bellamy estate stood quieter than anyone in Denver could remember. No orchestra music drifted through the ballroom windows anymore. No wealthy investors filled the dining halls whispering over railroad maps and whiskey glasses. By then, the newspapers had already printed every word Sheriff Holden uncovered from Clara's mother's journals. Signed contracts, false medical reports, letters proving Theodore Ashcombe planned to force the marriage in exchange for railroad control through Wyoming territory. Walter Bellamy never stood trial. 2 days before federal investigators arrived, the railroad tycoon locked himself inside his office and vanished from public life forever. Some people claimed he fled east. Others said grief finally caught him. Out on the frontier, nobody cared enough to chase the truth anymore. Because the only story people still talked about was the young woman who rode back into Denver beside a quiet cowboy and walked into court carrying nothing except a broken gold watch and the courage to speak. Elias never entered the courthouse with her. He waited outside beneath the cold autumn sky, holding the reins of his horse while crowds gathered along the street whispering Clara Bellamy's name. He hated cities. Always had. Too many men hiding cruelty beneath expensive coats and polished smiles. But when the courthouse doors finally opened hours later, Clara stepped outside, breathing like someone seeing daylight for the first time in years. Elias looked at her from across the street. "You all right?" Clara stared at him silently for several seconds before answering. "I think," she whispered softly, "I finally belong to myself again." The wind carried fallen leaves along the street between them, while church bells echoed faintly somewhere. Deeper in town. Then Clara crossed the road slowly toward him. No fear in her eyes now. No trembling in her hands. Just exhaustion finally beginning to loosen its grip around her heart. Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the broken watch she had accidentally left at the ranch before they boarded the train east. The cracked gold surface caught the pale afternoon sunlight between them. "Thought you might want this back," he said quietly. Clara took the watch carefully into both hands. Her thumb brushed the cracked glass exactly the same way it had beside the fire at the ranch weeks earlier. Then she looked up at him with a small, tired smile. "You know," she said softly, "it still does not work." Elias glanced toward the watch. "Neither do most people after enough years." Clara laughed quietly at that. Real laughter this time. Warm enough to soften even the cold Denver wind around them. A horse snorted impatiently nearby, while wagons rolled slowly down the muddy street behind them. Life continuing forward the way it always did out west. Clara looked toward the train station at the far end of town, where steam drifted upward against the gray autumn sky.